Thank you. Well, thank you very much, David and Nikolai. It's a real pleasure to be here in Arkansas. I grew up, as David said, in Bentonville, Arkansas, and went to many of the great educational institutions that we have here in our fair state, starting with Hendrix College. I spent 1 year there, and then because my sister was starting college also, it was too expensive at Hendrix. So off I went to the University of Arkansas in Fayetteville and ended up graduating there, and then starting on a path of with the old military. I, like so many people who are from the generation of the 60s, you know, I wanted to go out and do things. I wanted to see the world. At the time, the big occupations for women were school teachers, nurses, secretaries, and homemakers. All very good and honorable professions, and I didn't want to do any of them. I wanted to go travel and see the world, and when the Army recruiter came through Fayetteville, join the Army, see the world, even though it was during the Vietnam War. And I decided that was my way, kind of out of Arkansas, to join the Army. And I ended up staying in for a long time, 29 years, 13 on active duty and 16 in the reserves, and served in places such as Fort Bragg, North Carolina, Anniston, Fort McClellan, Alabama, the Presidio of San Francisco, to the Netherlands for a NATO-shaped sub-command assignment, Heidelberg, Germany. So the Army got me around to places that I wanted to see. It served my purposes very well, even though I joined during the Vietnam War. I never served in Vietnam and didn't want to. I did not really want to see war as such, even though our government was involved in it, and our military with 50,000 people who had been killed in it ultimately at the end of it. But I didn't want to go to war, like so many people in the military don't want to go to war. I ended up getting out of the military and joining with the State Department because I had enjoyed very much working with diplomats while I had been on active duty in the military. Because one of my assignments was down in Panama with the U.S. Southern Command, and we did a lot of work with the embassies in Central and South America. And so I ended up joining up with the State Department, taking the Foreign Service exams, and ended up in the embassies that David mentioned, the whole raft of them, starting with Nicaragua during the last days of the Sandinista government, Grenada, Somalia, Uzbekistan. Right after the fall of the Soviet Union, I was part of a team that went in to open an embassy in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, one of the former Soviet republics, and then a 2-year assignment in Kyrgyzstan, another Central Asian country. Then Sierra Leone, in the Civil War of Sierra Leone, and having to evacuate 2,500 people from Sierra Leone. That was the capital city having been overrun by the rebels in the country. After that, Micronesia, a peaceful assignment out in the middle of the Pacific, a little island group, 600 islands in a geographic area as big as the United States, but it's all water. Micronesia, and then I went on a special assignment with the State Department to the Office of the Governor of the State of Hawaii. That was a pretty good one. Helping the state of Hawaii put on an international economic conference. And then from there, 9/11 happened. And the United States decided to send military troops, well, first CIA and then military troops to Afghanistan after the events of 9/11. And I volunteered to be on a very small team of 5 people that went into Kabul, Afghanistan in December of 2001 to reopen the U.S. Embassy that had been closed there for 12 years. So we reopened the embassy, and I stayed for about 5 months, and then went on to what ultimately became the last assignment that I had in the Foreign Service, and that was as the Deputy Ambassador for our U.S. Embassy in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia. So as you can see, the length and spread of the places that I went for the United States government, both in the military and then in the State Department, was pretty, it was a variety of assignments, most of them in crisis areas during crisis times. But it was in March of 2003, 10 years ago, that I decided that after this nearly 35 years of government service, that I had to end my government service. And that was the decision of the Bush administration to invade and occupy an oil-rich Arab Muslim country that had not attacked America, had nothing to do with 9/11, that was alleged to have had weapons of mass destruction. And I, like many of the people outside of the government who were marching in the streets in America and all over the world, in the largest demonstrations against a war that were ever held in our world, I made up my mind that I was really very questioning. I was questioning very much the rationale of the Bush administration about this war, the need for the United States to start a war in Iraq. So as a part of this, I mean, I'm an old government employee. I've been in the government for a long, long time. I'd worked the systems in the military. I'd worked the systems in the State Department. I knew how you tried to affect policy changes in both of the organizations that I'd spent most of my life in. So I wrote a cable directly to Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, through a channel that we have in the State Department called the Dissent channel. I mean, it's for people who really do disagree with some policy of the State Department. And you have the opportunity to use this channel that goes straight from your desk in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, about as far away from Washington as possible, to go totally around the chain of command, and from my desk in Ulaanbaatar all the way to Washington, D.C., straight to the desk of Colin Powell with my concerns about this pending war in Iraq. And I let them have it. I told them exactly how dangerous this was going to be to America, how disastrous it was going to be for the people of Iraq, how I did question this whole issue of weapons of mass destruction, that I knew that the backlash from the Arab and Muslim countries of the world was predictable, that we knew that there would be hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of people in that part of the world, those parts of the world, that would be very angry at the United States for attacking Iraq. And I reminded Colin Powell that Saddam Hussein, who was not a good man by any means, had opened up Iraq to UN inspectors, that they were in Iraq at the time inspecting, trying to find these weapons of mass destruction, and I urged Colin Powell to please let the inspectors have more time to look for these things. Well, I sent my cable off, and this Dissent channel, going through that part of the way that you get to the senior leadership of the State Department on an urgent matter. It's supposed to be a channel that you can use without any retribution, without any retaliation, that it's just between you and Colin Powell. Well, but you always know somebody's got to write something in response, and it's not going to be Colin Powell. So there you have a little bit of a suspicion that you know, you're on a little bit of thin ice, that the bureaucracy that is supporting this decision that looks like it's going to be made, that the people that are going to be answering this thing are probably pretty senior people, and while you hope that they have taken your words for the honest manner in which they are given, for trying to help our country come to a real reasonable decision on the threats that are against our country, and that we would not hopefully go into wars that are for purposes that are not explicitly lined out, and in fact, maybe it's better not to go into wars. You know, that maybe there's a way to resolve these international issues without having to use our military. I mean, that's the goal I was hoping and thinking. But when I got back the answer from the State Department, it just didn't seem like that was really the way the State Department was approaching things, and certainly not the rest of our government, the Defense Department and the Office of the President and Vice President. And so the reply that came back to me gave me no solace at all that my words had any effect on the bureaucracy of the State Department. So I waited a couple of days to see what the direction was going to be of the government, whether it was going to continue this march toward war. And it was, and I finally made the decision that after these many decades of service to the country in both the military and the State Department, that I could not be a part of this war. And so I sent my cable of resignation to Colin Powell. I was one of 3 people who resigned. For the 3 of us, we didn't know each other. We were in different parts of the world. Brady Kiesling was our political counselor in our embassy in Athens, Greece. John Brown was on a special assignment with George Washington University in Washington, D.C., and I was all the way out in Mongolia. And we each wrote our heartfelt message to our leader about why we could no longer support the decisions of the Bush administration and the decisions of the State Department. And I thought, well, okay, since I'm resigning after all of these years in the government, I might as well just let them know everything I'm concerned about. Not only the pending war in Iraq, but some of the other things that I thought that our government needed to kind of get a better handle on, to do in a little bit different way. And you know, one of the questions that every U.S. diplomat gets, no matter in what part of the world you are about certain policies of the government that are mysterious to people. Why does America do certain things? And one of them is, why does America always support Israel on the Israeli-Palestinian issues? So I put that in there, that I thought the unbalanced policies of the Bush administration and previous administrations were harmful for the United States. I also put in there that I thought the Patriot Act, and this was, 2 years after the Patriot Act was enacted, was an unnecessary curtailment of civil liberties. And if I were resigning today, I'd write the whole resignation on that one. It turned out that my letter of resignation was the longest resignation letter in the history of the State Department. It was very interesting because, you know, you think after you resign from an organization and resign on principle and on conscience, and that the whole organization is just going to turn their back on you. But it didn't quite happen that way. All 3 of us that resigned received hundreds of emails from colleagues in the State Department and from other agencies in the government saying, you're doing the right thing. We really do need to have resignations. We need to have people saying, I will no longer work for an administration when they're doing things that I don't think are right for our country. And each one of the letters or the emails that we got would say, and I wish I could join you, but I've got kids in college, but I've got a mortgage, but there's always something, and they're all very reasonable and rational decisions. And that's really one of the reasons why I think we have so few resignations in our government. You know, resignation on principle, honestly, is not one of the hallowed traditions in America, and certainly not in the U.S. government. I mean, people just don't do that. Yet in other cultures, resignation on principle is part of the whole scheme of things. There were 5 times more people in the British government that resigned over Tony Blair's decision to go along with George Bush on the Iraq War than there were in the U.S. government. That only meant 15, but, but I mean, it was 15. It was, and some very senior people in the Blair administration resigned over the Iraq War. So here it is 10 years later. 10 years later, and many times I get asked, well, was it worth it? Are you glad you resigned? Don't you miss your career? And yes, I miss the career. I am glad I resigned because as an equal opportunity critic of administrations, I would have to say that right now, if I were in the government under the Obama administration, I would resign. That the issues of assassin drones, the issues of continued incarceration, indefinite detention of people in Guantanamo, where we have 164 people left out of the 779 people that were interned in Guantanamo. 164 are left. 84 of those, half of them, have been cleared for release, and most of them cleared for release over 5 years ago when George Bush was still president, and yet they are still in prison. The issue of assassin drones, where the United States has now killed with these unmanned aerial vehicles at least, well, between 2,800 and 3,200 people in Pakistan alone. We don't have the numbers in Afghanistan, but in the thousands. In Yemen, 64 people, between 64 and 82 have been killed. The Obama administration and President Obama, constitutional lawyer, who is the president who makes the decision on who lives and dies each week in what's called Terror Tuesday, when our 16 intelligence agencies give to the President of the United States a list of people that these agencies feel should die for what they have done against the United States or U.S. interests. And every week, the President becomes the chief prosecutor, judge, and executioner. And I don't believe that was given to the President of the United States for his decision-making. So these sorts of things are things that I would have to resign from this administration on. So the whole issue of how one approaches one's moral dilemmas in life, you know, this idea, what happened to me was that as a government employee, having to make a decision on whether or not I could continue in my career. Many times people don't have quite those weighty decisions of whether or not you're going to give up your career over something. But each one of us has decisions that we do make in our lives on working for a business, a corporation, in our daily lives with our friends, of how honest we are with people, how much we're willing to put forward our own honest opinions of how things are going, how much we might want to go along with the system. Let's just not rock the boat. Let's not challenge anyone on things that we know are wrong. I mean, we have two instances that are pretty dramatic that have happened since I've resigned. We have the issue of whistleblowers, and particularly whistleblowers on some very, very important issues of our government, our national security. And two whistleblowers that have revealed classified information that our government feels is information that we should not have, that it should remain classified. that even though the information part of it may disclose government malfeasance, misaction, maybe even governmental crimes, that these things should not be revealed to us and certainly not to anyone else. And so we have Private Chelsea Manning, formerly known as Bradley Manning, who 3 years ago revealed a huge amount of data to the world. Some 800,000 pieces of information, now known as the WikiLeaks, war logs, diplomatic logs. We have now Edward Snowden, who 4 months ago disclosed, we don't even know what he's disclosed. We're still finding that out as reporters, Glenn Greenwald and a couple of others, are slowly releasing things that Ed Snowden has put out. And yet we find that countries that are mentioned in these cables are very interested, or the people, well, the governments are interested that some of the conversations they've had with U.S. government officials are now out for public view. And citizens in these countries are very interested in what their governments have been up to with our U.S. government. I've just come back from a trip to Northeast Asia. I was in Shanghai, China 48 hours ago, and I'd been there for 2 weeks. I'd been to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and China. I was supposed to go to Okinawa, but a big typhoon got in our way. I'd been in Japan. I'd been asked to come over to speak at a conference on, of all things, the Japanese Constitution. Now, why would I be invited to go over there to talk about their Constitution? Except it's about an article, one article in their Constitution called the Article 9. And many of you may remember this from years ago. It's an article that actually the United States government had a great deal to do with, that article being put in the Japanese Constitution. And the article says that Japan will not go to war again, that it renounces war. And it's the only constitution in the world right now that has that. We certainly don't have it. But for the Japanese people, it's been a very important article in their constitution. After the Japanese army invaded most of Asia prior to the Second World War and then fought in so much of Asia, the Japanese people are pretty, they kind of like the last 68 years where they have not joined in anybody's wars. America needs some help, though, in its wars. And first the Bush administration and now the Obama administration are putting the full court press on the Japanese government to relook the legal foundation of their constitution, and particularly that pesky little Article 9 that says that Japan will not be a part of war anymore. So since I don't really agree with the wars in the United States, I'd been asked to come over and give my view of the importance of keeping Article 9 in the Japanese Constitution. While I was there, so many people would come up and say, you know, I didn't realize that our government had been working with your government on this, that, and the other thing, and it was only through WikiLeaks that I found out about it. And you know, if you look at books that are now being published, books that have been published from 2011, 2012, and now 2013 on national security affairs, if you go to the index of that and look WikiLeaks in that index, you're going to find that virtually every national security book that we have is using the materials that have come out from those leaks. So I guess the bottom line of this whole opportunity to talk to you is that being in the government is a very important task, and we need to have a lot of very good, honorable people that are in it. But we also need to have people in it who are willing to challenge the system, challenge it within the system, and then if that doesn't work and you feel so compelled about what you have seen that you're willing to take on the system by resigning from it or being a whistleblower on him are honorable things to do, that it is not unpatriotic to challenge your government, that it is what I hope is an ultimate form of patriotism, that you're willing to risk your career, that you're willing in some cases to go to jail because it is so important that what you feel needs to be revealed to the American public or to the world is so important that you're willing to give up your physical freedom for that. So I understand I'm supposed to speak for about 30 minutes and then give you all a chance to critique, comment, protest, dissent, whatever, from what I've said. And so I think I'll just end by saying it is a real pleasure to be back here in the Clinton School of Public Service. It has been a real honor to be here. I congratulate all of you all who are students here in coming to what seems to be a very, very fine, fine institution. And I wish you the very best of luck should you decide to go into public service. It is an honorable thing to do, but it's also a very honorable thing to challenge what's going on in our public service. Thank you.
Do we have any dissension questions? Yes. Hold on one second.
Do you think Colin Powell will ever fully reveal what went on leading up to the Iraq War?
Well, actually, he doesn't have to because it's been revealed for him. His chief of staff, Colonel Larry Wilkerson, who was his chief of staff when he was chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and then 8 years later when Colin Powell became Secretary of State, was asked by Powell to be a chief of staff in the State Department, has been very open about what went on in the lead up to the war in Iraq. Colonel Wilkerson says that the information that we were given as the world in the intelligence briefing that Colin Powell gave to the UN Security Council, if you remember back in like the middle of February of 2003, that they cherry-picked the very best of what the intelligence community was giving them. And what they came up with, what we saw, was the very best, but they knew it was not in any way a conclusive case that there were weapons of mass destruction. And Larry Wilkerson also says there was a reason why George Tenet was sitting right behind Colin Powell, that Colin Powell wanted to make sure that the American public and the world saw the face of the CIA right behind him, knowing where that intelligence was coming from. So I've been to several talks that Colin Powell has given since he's been out of office, and he does not answer that question. He talks first about his hot red Corvette and how great retirement is. And then when it really gets to the nuts and bolts of foreign policy, and particularly those decisions that were made in 2003, he doesn't talk about them. His wife, though, has said that that intelligence briefing was a blot on the reputation of their family.
Ann, I have a question for you. Considering corporate-run government, I am looking at depositions that came through with the Democratic Policy Committee in 2006, where Halliburton, Kellogg, Brown and Boot, and all of these companies fed through fraud in the Iraqi war. All of these depositions, whistleblowers suits, and a whistleblower suit, a Ketam that I filed myself under the Bush administration, have all been thrown out. These suits are billions of dollars in fraud, hundreds and thousands of lives. And my suit 9 years ago this week in federal court, a key tam, along with these, have all been thrown out. How can someone justify ruining their lives? And they do ruin your life. Knowing that these key tams, these whistleblowers, are being dismissed despite the fact that you and I both know how very difficult it is to obtain the prima facie evidence in order to even foul one. How can we justify that?
It is unjustifiable. And what the frauds that have been perpetrated on the people of the United States by many of the actions of many of the contractors that we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq are horrific. I mean, this has been the wars are big money makers. There's no doubt about that, you know, and there's a real reason why America will, in my opinion, continue to be a warmongering country. That it is in the corporate interests of America that a huge portion of America's budget goes toward war. And these cases that you're mentioning of people who are bringing up fraud, waste, and abuse and trying to get them into federal court to be looked at, that the courts are just throwing them out. And it's not from lack of evidence, but it's part of overall view that, in my opinion, I mean, these are things that we need to ask the judges really more about. But my opinion is that we as the American Republic have had a massive fraud perpetrated on us. The Inspector Generals of the Department of Defense, the State Department, they issue some pretty damning reports about fraud, waste, and abuse. And it really takes people taking specific instances to court as you have done, although I don't know the specifics of your case, but as you mentioned, there have been hundreds of these cases that have been brought by people who know exactly what went on, and yet very, very few of them have ever resulted in the corporations or the companies suffering any sort of financial loss because of it, much less anyone going to jail for purposeful fraud against the government. But it is something we should be concerned of. I mean, our budgets, 26% of our national budget goes to the Department of Defense, another 4% goes into the Veterans Administration. You in Arkansas will be paying of your total tax platform for all the people of Arkansas. $3 billion of your taxes will go to the Department of Defense next year. And in Little Rock, it's about $450 million from people of the Little Rock area will be going to the Department of Defense. And that doesn't even include the cost of wars. That's charged off on a supplemental budget and out of the regular budget. So we are paying a lot of money for war. And when you look at the other things that we are giving up, the social services that are not being funded, the highways that are not being funded, you all know them. You know from your daily lives what's not happening. You know the huge financial debt that students who get to go to college are now under, versus us having a system where we can fund people to get an education, but we really are as a nation using it for war.
In your case, when you resigned, you weren't breaking any law and you didn't suffer any immediate consequences there. In the case of Private Manning, he did violate the law, and evidently he will be suffering the consequences. But doesn't it seem more difficult to understand Mr. Snowden's situation, where he's saying that our government is secretive and he finds refuge in Russia?
Well, it is a little strange. There's no doubt about that. And I'm still perplexed about he had certainly made plans to a certain point to at least get to Hong Kong before he was revealing what he was going to reveal. Now, I would have thought that they would have already had a ticket for him to be someplace else by the time the videos of his interviews came out in Hong Kong. So it is very perplexing. And I would say in the long run for him, I mean, it may be the safest place for him, but it politically and from the rationale of if he wants support from the American public, I think it's a little harder when he is in Russia. That said, four of some very good friends of mine visited with him a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago. They were the four that flew to Russia to give him an award for truth-telling. And all of them former government employees. Ray McGovern, former presidential briefer from the CIA. Jesselyn Radick, former Justice Department attorney. Colin Rowley, FBI agent, Time Woman of the Year in 2002 for being a whistleblower, and Tom Drake, who had had his run-in with the NSA and the law when he revealed that NSA was spending billions of dollars unnecessarily on some programs that he did not identify. But the fact that he revealed fraud, waste, and abuse got him in big trouble with the government, and they prosecuted him, but pulled the case back at the last moment. So he did not go to jail. Those four people did go to Russia to give him an award for truth-telling. But I do believe that the fact that he ended up in Russia, and I mean the stories that'll eventually come out that we'll find out about how all of that happened, I think it's a little bit harder for him on some levels to get sympathy within the American public because of just the fact that he is in Russia. I don't particularly think he's giving any secrets to the Russians. I think they're coming out. The Russians are just as surprised as we are when the next interview with Ed Snowden comes out and something else is revealed. That's just my supposition.
Run right here, and then Judge Griffin.
I'd like to say thank you very much for coming. I look at this as a wake-up call for each and every one of us that's here in this room. And first, I'd like to start with Fukushima Daiichi, Japan. Is it as bad? Or are we at a place that we have never been with such a plant, even bypassing Chernobyl? That's my first question. My second question is concerning our government today and how we can encourage each and every one of us in places low and high to stand for moral morality, things we need to stand up for and make a decision whether we stand or fall or go along with the program. And my other question I wanted to ask you, was concerning the Gitmo situation down there. Is it ever going to be resolved as a country, as it plays out on the international stage?
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe I'll start with the last one first, since I can remember that one, and then you'll have to remind me of the rest. Guantanamo, President Obama, as part of his campaign, he was going to close Guantanamo within a year. And he got a lot of pushback from the Congress, who refused to fund even removal of the remaining prisoners out of Guantanamo. Even the Obama administration is saying that there are some people there that will never be put on trial, which to me is horrifying. It's horrifying. And it's horrifying to the rest of the world that this supposed model of democracy, model of a good, strong legal system that many people in the world had really looked to America about, is now saying that we have done some things to some people that we will never admit in a court of law that's happened. And so we're not going to try them. There are some breakthroughs in this, though. If you think about the person that was kidnapped and extraordinarily rendered, which are the legal terms for kidnapping somebody out of Libya, which happened 2 weeks ago, and flying him not to Guantanamo, but to New York, where he will be tried in a federal court. That is a good sign. Not that he was kidnapped, but that he was not taken to Guantanamo. And it does show that federal courts are certainly capable of handling any of alleged terrorism cases. They've done it over the last 40 years. Everyone that's been convicted of terrorism charges and who have been put in U.S. federal penitentiaries, not one of them has ever escaped. So it is pitiful that we have a second administration that's saying that there are some people that will never get a trial. You know, there have only been 5 trials anyway, only 5 out of 779. The American program of bounties, where we paid for people who were being turned in by enemies all over the world. We paid up to $5,000 if they were alleged to be a Taliban, $25,000 if they were Al-Qaeda. Osama bin Laden had, what, a $5 million or $25 million bounty on his head. Well, the bounty program proved that a lot of people get turned in, but the statistics on who gets tried and convicted are pretty pitiful on it. That we were, because of our inability to even talk to the people and relying on interpreters, and then not acknowledging that we were sold a bill of goods and turning people loose, but keeping them for years and years. It is a real wonder that people from Yemen, from people from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, who have been released, who in general have not, I mean, less than 4% of those that have been released have ever done anything against U.S. interests after that. That they have allowed America to get off with massive human rights abuses toward them. Let's go to the first question. And what was that? Oh, Japan, Fukushima, yeah. Well, yes, Fukushima it is the world's worst nightmare. And with this latest typhoon that skirted the mainland and tragically hit some of the islands off the east shore of Japan and caused massive landslides. If the force of that had actually gone onto the mainland into Fukushima, the 400-ton cooling tank that is tottering there probably would have come down. And the levels of radiation that would have come out of that would have been horrific. There's radioactive water that is leaking into the Pacific Ocean every single day. I mean, hundreds of thousands of gallons of radioactive water. The Japanese government has closed all of their nuclear facilities. The anti-nuclear group in the country is very careful to point out that there has not been a brownout or a blackout of electricity, that there is adequate electricity without the nuclear reactors. And other places in the region, like South Korea, which has, one of the places I visited on this trip was a complex that has 4 nuclear reactors right on the ocean that are operating right now, and 8 more being built right in the same concentrated area, which is 35 kilometers from Seoul, the capital. China is embarking on building 130 more nuclear reactors. And yet we don't have, as a world, we don't know where we're going to put all the radioactive materials. We don't have plans for how we accommodate or how we react to major failures in these nuclear systems. So it is a very worrisome world as far as nuclear energy is concerned, in my opinion. And your issue of, your comment about we should all, yes, thank you. we should all challenge everything, I think.
Judge, it's coming to your right.
Thank you, Colonel Wright. Given what you have seen and the current situations that you have spoken about, compounded by the drone killings, Gitmo, everything else, what, in your view, is the validity of the notion that the United States has, quote, a moral or ethical high ground that it's supposed to stand on to project to the world. Put differently, how do we now call ourselves the bright city on a hill that President Reagan liked to talk about?
Well, I think the bright city's lights have gone out. I don't think we have any moral high ground. And as you travel the world, as I'm sure many of you all do, you hear that from a lot of people, that America is not the leading nation in much anymore. Human rights, no. I mean, look at Guantanamo. Look at what's gone on in Iraq and Afghanistan. We don't really have any moral high ground. And, you know, when the President of the United States just a month ago at the UN Security Council, or the UN General Assembly, gave his speech to the collected leaders of the world and said that America is an exceptional nation. I mean, I was heartstruck. I mean, I was horrified. I mean, because the rest of the world sees what we do. I think we as Americans are pretty good, as most people would be. You know, people put blinders on their eyes for their own country, but there are no blinders on the other people around the world, and they know exactly what's been going on, of wars of choice, of kidnapping, extraordinary rendition, indefinite detention, eavesdropping, everybody's cell phone, emails up for grabs by the NSA. These are things that the world now sees as America. And our moral standing in the world is, in my opinion, pretty low. There are some things that could be done very quickly that would start moving it back up a little bit. I think closing Guantanamo would certainly be one of those things. I think the decision, however it came about by the Obama administration not to attack Iraq, was something that gave us a little more footing in the world. Not to say that something did happen in Syria. I mean, not to attack Syria. Something did happen in Syria. There were people that were killed by chemical weapons. But the fact that there is so much dispute in the international community about what really happened and who did it, and for whatever reason that the president decided he would take the temperature of Congress, and that the people of the United States, following the lead of the British Parliament, but the people of the United States had really their first victory over war. That there were so many Americans that emailed and called the Congress and the President and the White House that President Obama had to back off what looked to be a pretty imminent attack on the Assad government in Syria. And because of being backed off of that, and I'm sure the Obama administration said, well, that was our threat. And because we threatened in that way, it forced the Assad government to start working first with the Russian government, and now you see that internationally we've now been allowed to go in and check about chemical weapons and whatever. Well, whatever rationale they're willing to use, that's fine with me. I'm just glad that we didn't attack Syria, and I think that the United States has a little bit of a stepstone now, that we haven't caused another military conflict addressed. I mean, there is one going on, but at least we're not directly involved. We are now giving weapons to some parts of the rebel forces, for sure. But at least it was not at a direct cruise missile going into Damascus.
We have two questions right there.
One of the comments that you've made, you talk of weapons of mass destruction. And it seems to me that there's been some sort of a propaganda victory here when people lump nuclear weapons with chemical weapons or poison gas, because one kills millions, the other thousands. And the Bush administration, I think, deliberately did that because Condoleezza Rice at first was saying, don't let a nuclear cloud be your smoking gun, and so on. So they implied to us that there were nuclear weapons, and then they pulled back and then they said weapons of mass destruction. And yet, I think that was deliberately done for propaganda reasons because they were pretty certain they wouldn't find nuclear weapons there. But they thought probably they'd find chemical weapons because we had probably supplied them with chemical weapons, et cetera. So they thought they were safe. And yet people still say weapons of mass destruction, including both. Don't you think that should be changed?
Well, indeed, the propaganda that the Bush administration put out was quite remarkable when you really look back at it, and the words that were being used by Dick Cheney, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Rumsfeld, and President Bush. And the specter of nuclear weapons that are being pushed on us all the time, of the nations that don't have it, we know they don't have it, and our intelligence community say that there are no programs really leading toward it, which that would be Iran. And then on the other one, another one of the, one of the great unfortunate phrases of this century is the axis of evil. I mean, the whole issue that a president of the United States in 2002 at the State of the Union message, George Bush said there, with Hamid Karzai sitting right in the halls of Congress in that State of the Union message, and I know it because we had put Hamid Karzai on a U.S. military plane in Kabul and then, or at Bagram, and then he had flown to Turkey and then flown to the United States to barely make it to sit there to what we thought was going to be the Bush administration's kind of rollout of what the U.S. would be contributing in terms of non-lethal aid to Afghanistan, things like programs for schools, medical clinics, roads, and like that. But instead, very little of that State of the Union message was about Afghanistan. And I can remember that the camera kept looking back at Hamid Karzai. It was the first time we ever got a TV to work in our old embassy in Kabul. We were down in a bunker. It's where the 5 of us lived, in a bunker. And we had this little makeshift satellite dish that was made actually out of pounded out Coke cans. The Afghan technicians knew how to do it, so fine, if you can make this thing work, fine. And so here we had Coca-Cola beaming up to the skies, and here came George Bush's State of the Union message, and here was Hamid Karzai, yeah, I made it, fine, great. And then nothing about Afghanistan really, other than the interim president of Afghanistan has joined us up here, no applause. But there are other issues of the world that the United States is concerned of. We're concerned about Iran, Iraq, North Korea, the axis of evil. Well, those of us that were sitting in our little embassy in Afghanistan went, uh-oh, this is trouble. I mean, here we are, we thought we were kind of like in ground zero of the aftermath of 9/11 in Kabul, Afghanistan, but the focus has now shifted to other places, to Iran, Iraq, North Korea, and as we found out later, plans were already underway that U.S. military troops were already going into Kuwait. They were getting ready for a year later for what was going to be the invasion of Afghanistan. So back to your question of the nuclear weapons, and here we have North Korea that has exploded nuclear weapons, and why did they explode them? My theory is, and many other people mention this, is that the threats that come from the United States, that if you get threatened enough, you've got to have something to threaten back. And to the credit, I would say, of the Iranian government, which still maintains that they are not, they do not have a nuclear weapons program. I mean, from the highest level of the spiritual leader of Iran, they have not gone down that path, but the North Koreans did, because they needed something to push back from the American threats. And if you think about Northeast Asia right now and the threats with the Obama pivot toward Asia and the Pacific, that pivot has some very, very dangerous aspects to it. I mean, the focus of the U.S. commentary about the ever-increasing Chinese military, that the Chinese now have an aircraft carrier. It is a threat to the United States of America, a threat to our 13 U.S. aircraft carriers. I mean, the largest country in the world, the country of the world that if it should stop sending those hundreds of thousands of containers on endless ships coming out of the port of Shanghai that we just sailed through, if they ever stopped that flow, we would be naked within 6 months. I mean, here you have, I mean, we have put all of our economic eggs in the Chinese basket, and yet we are threatening them militarily by military operations and exercises that are going on in the area, by putting more military forces into Asia. We now have the first military base in Australia, plus a drone base in Australia. We have pushed the South Koreans to build a new Navy base. I mean, in South Korea, you need another military base, and yet there's a new base to house, to home port Aegis missile destroyers, which are going to be a part of the U.S. missile defense system for the region. I mean, there are reasons why there is rhetoric that comes out of North Korea that is very, very harsh, and that they have taken steps which they hope will mean that the United States will not attack them. And I was on a ship as a part of this Northeast Asia trip, on a ship called the Peace Boat. Now, isn't that not the Love Boat, but the Peace Boat? And the Peace Boat has been sailing around the world for 30 years. It has not accomplished its goal of peace, but it is trying. And on this particular voyage in Northeast Asia, 500 Japanese and 500 South Koreans and 1 American were on board that ship. And the ship was to bring together groups of people who need to learn more about each other. You know, in Japan right now, there are hate crimes, there are hate speech that are going on against Koreans. In China, there's hate speech against Japanese. Well, this cruise of Japanese and Koreans were to bring them together and to have on board all sorts of people talking about various issues of concern to both of them, and to take them to areas of concern. We started out in Japan, then picked up the people in South Korea. We went to the nuclear plants in South Korea and other places. Then we went all the way down to Taiwan to talk about the issues of the islands there that are under dispute by China, Vietnam, Japan, whatever. We were going back to Okinawa, the island of Japan that houses 75% of the U.S. military bases in Japan are on this one island, and the Okinawan people are fed up with them. They want the U.S. to get out of there, and the U.S. has agreed to a certain extent to pull troops out. We didn't get there because human nature, not human nature, Mother Nature. Mother Nature intervened with the 3rd typhoon that I had seen since I'd been there for 2 weeks. I mean, talk about global warming and changes in weather patterns. Big typhoons coming through. Well, anyway, so we headed on to our next port, which was Shanghai, China. And I went with 100 of the Japanese to, on the bullet train, the Chinese bullet train, that the Japanese were going, this bullet train looks pretty good. This bullet train actually goes faster than our Japanese bullet trains go. These train stations look like airports. I mean, if you think about the building, the construction that's going on in the largest country in the world with the greatest population, and what it's taken in the last 30 years to get China to the place where it is and then where it wants to go. The largest building construction projects in the history of the world are going on right now in China. Well, we were on the bullet train taking 100 Japanese to Nanjing, old Nanking. Remember back in the 30s, the rape of Nanking, 300,000 Chinese killed by the Imperial Army of Japan in 3 months. In 90 days, 300,000 people killed. And most of the women that were killed were raped by the Japanese soldiers before they were killed. Well, there's a museum in Nanjing that if you ever go to China, make sure you go there. It is one of the most poignant museums you'll ever see of the history of war. And to have these Japanese that said, we want to go, we want to see this, because our Japanese government is saying they're rewriting history, as most governments do. They're rewriting history. They're rewriting out the numbers of people that were killed in Nanjing. They're rewriting out the fact that there were comfort women, over 200,000 women from all over Asia that became sex slaves of the Imperial Army of Japan. That's being written off by Japanese history. And these 100 Japanese wanted to go to apologize to the people of Nanjing for what their army had done 60 years ago, 70 years ago, 80 years ago. It was a very poignant time. And these are things of trying to get cultures to come together. And in Northeast Asia, where every one of the cultures say, we don't want war. The Chinese were saying to us as we were in that museum, we don't want war. We don't want to have any military operations going on. The Japanese saying, we've seen it too, we don't want it anymore. The South Koreans saying, we don't want it, we've seen it also. So trying to pull our own government back from continually beating the military operations and the war drums, I think is a very important thing that we as citizens need to try to do.
Well, I know there's many questions left. Please come up afterwards. We're running out of time. Colonel Wright, thank you so much for coming, and thank all of you for coming out.
Thank you very much. Thank you.